Okay, this is the lecture for um, we're looking at building musical skill and performance. Today's chat may be a little bit short because I'm not really going over stuff that was in the text necessarily, maybe a little bit, but most of this is going to be talking about things that are a little bit outside of that. Um, in the text, it talks about memory, but we talked about that earlier in the semester, so I'm not going to deal with the memory section. The first thing we're going to talk about how important controlling movements are to musical development, specifically about motor learning and as well as expressive timing. And then we'll talk a little bit about the conducting study that you read and some of the research that kind of goes along with that, other studies that have been done looking into that. So when we look at motor skills, there are these different terms that are similar but are slightly different. So motor control is how neuromuscular systems coordinate movements. If you're able to do it, then you have motor control. Motor development is how your potential for skills changes over time. So, we normally think about that as gaining a certain skill. Motor skill is voluntary goal-directed activity or task. And the motor learning is how we acquire and refine those motor skills. So when we practice music, a lot of what we're doing is refining that motor coordination and that we were trying to get motor learning. And so similar to like what we did when we talked about practice, there are certain types of practice that are better for building up motor coordination and motor learning. One, a mental practice. It does help with motor learning, but you have to use it in coordination with physical practice. But it does activate the neurological motor systems, which is pretty unbelievable. That just by thinking about what part of the body you use to do something, like if you think of playing a B flat scale on the clarinet, your brain will activate. It will activate those parts of the motor cortex that use that. That would be used. When we talked about practice, we talked about massed practice versus distributed practice, and we said that distributed practice is better overall than mass practice because it gives time for the pathways to really cement, and that's exactly true for coordination. We talked a little bit about sleep consolidation in the last lecture, where if you sleep, it helps promote those neural connections. Whereas if you do other activities that might affect they might interfere with those motor pathways or neural pathways developing. If you do variable practice, where if you do things like practice things in dotted rhythms, or if you practice them in different tempos, that actually promotes motor learning, as well as doing tasks in random order. It just helps build the motor pathways. So those are definitely things that help with motor coordination. Some studies have looked at your focus of attention and how that can affect your coordination. If you think about it like a golfer, if a golfer is thinking about his swing, then he may not be as good as if he's thinking about where he's hitting it to or trying to get it in the hole. And so studies have looked at, is it better to think about your internal focus, your body position, your fingers, your breathing, or is it better for you to have an external focus, thinking about the sound you create or thinking about the audience, which can help in motor coordination? And the research so far, it really recommends that you use an external focus, that you're thinking outside of your body when you're performing to help with the motor coordination. The text talks a little bit about different types of feedback that help in practice or developing. And musicians automatically receive oral and proprioceptive feedback, which is task intrinsic feedback. So you can think about that as in you're hearing the sound, you might see that your hands are not in the right hand position. You might feel something incorrectly. So if you're playing scales on the piano and you feel that something is wrong, it's not necessarily you hear something, and then proprioceptive is just that knowing something is wrong without it necessarily being straight from one of those senses. In the text, it talked about how when looking at brain scans of musicians, the brain already knew that they had made a mistake before before the motor pathway actually depressed the key. So it shows that the brain is always kind of on top of what is supposed to happen and getting that feedback back. There's another type of feedback called augmented feedback, which is what you get from something external. It could be from teachers or from tuners or from metronomes, but that's a different type of feedback. Okay, so now I'm going to switch gears just a little bit to talk about movement and timing. And as it mentions in the text, musical time is not perfect. Even though we have an internal clock and it is somewhat consistent, it is not consistent on a continuous basis. It's like it says, percussionists, they really try to train themselves so that they are really, really consistent. But even percussionists, when you look at it from a completely objective, by looking at the milliseconds, that there is variability between onsets, and the book does a good job of talking about how there's some of that is because of the internal clock itself has some incongruity, or it's a motor coordination, and that you can't quite make the musculature move at the exact same way for every time that you hit the beat. I'm going to talk a little bit about expressive timing, and this is one thing that I think that we don't really ever talk about. We don't ever really give it a name, but it's something that we all do as musicians, and this has been trained in us. And when I think about my experiences as a high school teacher, I don't think our students really felt independent, that they were able to do the expressive timing themselves, but they follow us in our conducting. And so that's something that we should try to make them more responsible for. But anyway, so one of the things that is that one of the most obvious ways that we see this expressive timing is that the phrase final lengthening. You get to the end of the last phrase and you really take your time, and that happens all over the place. At the beginning of phrases you speed up a little bit, and at the end of each phrase you slow down a little bit. Even in things that are not rubato or are from the Romantic period, we still do that a little bit. Even in Bach you do that a little bit. And the book talks a little bit too about asynchronous voice leading, and this is mostly for keyboardists, when they're trying to voice the chord in a certain way. One technique that performers do is that they, it's a very short, just lead on the chord that they will, play the note that gets emphasis a little bit before the other ones. And so we kind of understand that we see the chord as being all in the same time, but we hear that note as being more important. So one of the reasons why um, expressive timing is really important is that it relays a lot of information about expressive performance, which is the realization of musical understanding and performance. Expressive aspects are not necessarily memorized, but they're internalized. And that's kind of what I was talking about before. We really don't give it a name, but we just know to do it. And so, like, when you're memorizing your piece of music, you normally aren't thinking, oh, I need to slow this down to this tempo. And no, it's just internalized. Um, a definition for expressive timing is how performers manipulate musical time to reveal structural properties. And I'm going to talk in just for a minute about expressive movement. But talking about expressive performance for a minute, there is a theory out there called the quantitatively average performance theory. And this idea is under the assumption that people like things in the average. And this is something that we see in statistics all the time. It's a regression to the mean. So, so the idea is that when people have variations in a way to be expressive on a particular piece of music, that that the expressive performance may be thought of as a variation around a norm. So let's think of, Bach Prelude number 1. There is a way that there is an average way that everyone can play that, and then people play variations of it that are similar or dissimilar to that. Well, there is, through research, they found that there is an appeal to what is closest to that average performance versus, someone taking a really liberal use of some sort of musical gesture. So think about it, and you can think of this way. Like, if you hear a piece of music that is composed much more quickly or much slower than what you expect, even if it's done really well, you might be like, oh, that still wasn't as satisfying as something else. I'm going to play some examples for you in a minute, but so there was a researcher named Rep, and he was really interested in this, and so he had, I need to go to a website. Okay, so he had 9 graduate students in piano, and he had 15 recordings of professionals playing the same piece of music. I think this is this is Chopin's Etude in E major, and he chose this because there is an element of there's an element of rubato in it, and so there's a lot of flexibility. So let's hear just a couple of examples. We'll only listen to a few seconds each. So here's one example. And here's another example. So you just hear different musical choices. Let's see. This might have been the one I just played. And here is the last one. So what he did was he took all those performances and then he averaged the length of all the notes, and so he called that the average performance. And so this is what that sounds like when you elongate the notes to whatever the average was. Okay, so what he did in his experiment is he then had people rate how much they liked each of those things, each of those examples. And, so there were 16 total, and of those, the participants, they liked the average the best. Then a couple others were also highly rated as well. But it kind of goes to, and this is where he builds his theory off of, is that it's the average of all of these musical choices. Some people take a lot longer on that first note, and some people just kind of go straight into it. And it's actually the average of those things that people like. And like I said, this kind of makes sense when we think of, especially when we know a piece of music and we hear it being performed. If someone takes a lot of liberty with the tempo or does something a little different, like, we're not terribly enthusiastic about it. And so it kind of shows that we are drawn to a certain type of musical timing. Now, there are some things to think about, because the people that rated them, they were students, and so maybe they don't quite have the same preference for musical timing as the performers did. Because they may have preferred the longer. The performers may prefer the longer, slower tempo. The other thing too is that they couldn't separate timing from other dynamics that affect the stimulus. So it could be that it wasn't necessarily the timing that they were being drawn to, but it could be the use of dynamics or the use of pedal or those sorts of things. So now, expressive movement. This was talked a little bit about in the book, and it's really talking about why performers, like how performers move and why they do that. And this is a field that's really growing in music cognition. They call it musical gesture, and gesture can kind of mean anything. And so it's really examining how musicians move and what kind of information does that movement really communicate to other musicians, communicate to the audience. And some of these things could just be from basic swaying. And I mean, think about a clarinet player who is pretty motionless, as far as like their hands move, but they really don't have to move their torso at all. But they really do kind of do this, like when they're really expressive, they do this kind of swaying thing. Or, pianists, when they do really extended gestures, what is that communicating? And the research right now is saying, for the most part, it's really communicating to the audience or to other performers what is going on musically. And that it can communicate things about the phrase. It can communicate things about the kind of the mood of the piece. There's a lot of research and like I said, they mostly look at clarinetists because they don't have to move, yet they do. In the book, it talks about the different ways that we are studying this. It could be from kind of doing computer scans of where movement is happening, or more recently, they're doing a lot more with, I can't think of the point system, where like they put those little markers on you, and then as you move, you can see what kind of movement is being done. I'm really interested in looking at beatboxers and their movements. I want to do a study on it, but I haven't planned to do it anytime soon. Just because beatboxers, they don't have to move. There's nothing, like all the stuff that they do with their hand doesn't change the sound. So everything that they do, to me, is about how it's either them organizing the sound or it's trying to help organize the sound for other people. And so I think that's something to think about when we think about movement and in musicians. And so that kind of brings us to the study that you read about, where it was looking at conducting. And I need to change my notes here. So yeah, so the thing, when we think about movement and music, we have to remember that music itself is a multi-dimensional experience. Like, we like to think about it as being auditory, but it really is multisensory. There is, until a very short time ago, within the last 100 years, you pretty much had to be in the room with someone else that was making the music. Radio, and then records and tapes, and now we have things that are portable. That makes us think that music is this completely aural form, but is really multisensory, and that a lot of the information we get in performance is visual. And so movement, it helps generate the music. It is the thing that's actually creating the music. It helps facilitate the music. That's the movement between the musical gestures of music that happen between musicians, and then it helps communicate the music, as I was just talking about. So the study that you read is by Stephen Morrison. He's done quite a few studies that are similar to that, where it looks at movement and evaluation of performances. And for instance, before he did that study that you read about, there was a study where he took pieces, and people were either, they just saw an audio version of it, or they saw an audio and video. And what they found is that some things that were audio and video together, they liked a lot more, because the hypothesis is that they can understand it better, because things are easier to understand. You understand the phrase. You can understand the phrase boundaries. You can understand intention a little bit more. So we say that music is really also a visual. There are visual cues that inform the performance, and some of those things are not necessarily musical at all. Like I was saying, it could be these musical gestures that inform something, but there are all these other messages that we get that influence our perception, and those include gender. People rate performances when they see, even if it's the same performance, they hear the same audio, but they see a man playing or a woman playing, they evaluate it differently. Attractiveness. If people are more attractive, they are viewed as being better at it, even if it's the same audio. In the same way, like, there are definitely influences on ethnicity and eminence and expressivity. These are things that we are that are all at play when we're evaluating a performance. So people can get a lot of information from looking at musicians play. And there was a study that was done that took ordinary people, not even musical experts, and they either played them clips of a piano competition, only the sound, or they gave them only video of these clips, or they gave them video and sound, and they asked them who of these were the winner of these of the piano competition. Well, when they gave them sound or video plus sound, they were around chance of getting it right of who won the competition. But when they were only given video, they were able to identify much more often than by chance who the winner of the competition was. And so the reason why this is important is because it shows that when somebody looks like they're a winner, our brain just automatically, it shows that visual, those visual cues are really important in how we assess. I think the reason why the sound was not helpful is because for people that didn't necessarily look like a winner, then the sound kind of made it harder for the non-experts to figure out who the winner was. But it explains that, if they were musical experts, if they were people that judge piano contests, that they are the ones that chose these people as to be the winner. Okay, so the study that you looked at conductor expressivity. If people that conducted expressively, are their ensembles viewed as sounding better? And there's two assumptions that are being tested in the study. One, that the quality of the conductor affects the way an ensemble performs. And two, that good conducting facilitates good teaching. So those are two of the things that Morrison was really looking at when he started looking at this. So his hypothesis is that conductor expressivity will affect listeners' evaluation of an ensemble performance. So just as a reminder, so what he did was he took two conductors and he had them perform either expressively, and he kind of describes what that is in the article, or low expressivity, which, would be, few facial expressions, limited range of hand gestures, that sort of thing. And so then he had a group of students, they were music students, evaluate the expressivity of the conductor as well as the expressivity or the performance of the ensemble. And there were two groups. Some rated the ensemble and rated the conductor, and then some rated the ensemble and then they were to comment on individual things about the conductor, so that there wouldn't be, like he suggested, that that there wouldn't be this relationship of ensemble and conductor all the time. That, thinking about, if they put 4 for a conductor and then 4 for ensemble, it didn't always mirror what they rated for the conductor's rating. And so what they found was that those that were, that had and this is the thing that's important, is that the clips sounded exactly the same. They used the exact same audio in the high expressivity as they did in the low expressivity. And so it was not, there wasn't, there's no reason for there to be differences on the performance of the ensemble. So what they find is those that have the high conducting, the high expressivity conducting, that they view those as much stronger performances by the ensemble than those with low expressivity, which is, makes sense. So Morrison, I don't think he mentions this in the article, I don't remember, but he says that it's kind of this McGurk effect, which the McGurk effect is, so what the effect is that our visual operating system is so much stronger than our auditory system. Our visual system is stronger than our auditory system. And so when those things conflict, our brain goes with what it sees, not what it hears, what it sees. And in psychology, we found this effect called the McGurk effect, which I'm gonna put a link up on the website, and you guys should watch this, where if you hear the word ba, B-A, ba, but I show you the visual of ga, then what you hear, and if I show you the visual of ga and you hear ba, like if we edited you actually hear va. You hear something different. And that's because your brain is trying to make sense of what the visual thing. And if you close your eyes and listen to it, you'll hear ba, but if you open it up, you hear ga. So the video clip that I'm going to, the link that I'm going to put on there, it's only 3 minutes long. You have to watch it. It's so trippy. So he's saying here that essentially there's this musical McGurk effect happening where our ears are hearing something different than our eyes are seeing, but our eyes, our visual system essentially monopolizes what the brain is thinking about. So he concludes that evaluation of music performance rely on factors apart from sound. Expressive conducting may be an integral part of ensemble performance. And he still had other questions. Does conducting quality enhance or detract from a performance? Are specific expressive elements more salient? So he does another study, which essentially shows the exact same thing, where the visual information is consequential across the performance context and viewer experience. So he did it with choral ensembles, and so that's where he says, again, across performance contexts. And that non-expressive conducting had a negative effect on evaluations. So he comes to think that what we see, especially in conducting, what it's telling the audience is prediction, is showing us what's about to happen. And so that's one reason why we highly value expressive conducting. And then the other thing is that it gives us congruence. It shows how things are the same and how things are different. So that's a little bit about the research that looks at expressive conducting. If you perform with an ensemble, then just know you need to make really big gestures and act as if you feel like you are listening to the best thing ever, and the audience will think it sounds good too. So that's the takeaway from that. All right, so that is this week's lecture. We only have one more to go, and then it's the end of the semester. Please email me if you have any questions. You probably have your evaluations have been sent to you, so please take the time to do that. It's what the feedback that I need to get, one, to make the class better, but two, just mostly so that I can make sure that you get out of the class what you are interested in learning about. All right, thanks again. Have a good week.